Hello and welcome in today's edition of the Daf Yomi Brachos Daf 22 Amud A. So let's dive straight in. Kedei lefar sama v'niftara min ha-Bekhorot. The Gemara answers, it must be buried in order to publicize that the animal is exempt from his future often counted a firstborn. The Gemara notes with regard to the ruling of the Mishnah that the animal is exempt from having any future offspring counted as firstborn, that is to say that the expelled mass of full-fledged offspring. But if so, why doesn't it publish impurity, neither through physical content nor through carrying? Rabbi Yochanan says it's due to halachic nullification of forbidden substances in a majority of permitted substances that the sages touched. Just move the camera a little bit. Sorry. The sages touch upon it in order to exclude it from impurity through contact or carrying. In other words, the fetus is in fact considered a full-fledged offspring, but it is not in part impurity because it is nullified by the rest of the conjugal mass. The Gemara comments, Rabbi Yochanan follows this line of reasoning in this regard. As Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov and Rabbi Shimon both said the same thing. They issued rulings based on the same principle. The relevant statement of Rabbi Elazar ben Yaakov is that which we said previously, i.e. that the expelled mass is not in part of impurity because the fetus is nullified by the majority. And what is the statement of Rabbi Shimon to which Rabbi Yochanan was referring? It says, we learned in the Mishnah in 18a, if a woman miscarried and the afterbirth is in the house, so what's the footnote? Hashirya babayis. If a woman emitted an afterbirth in a house, the entire house is rendered impure, as it is assumed that the afterbirth always contains a fetus. This ruling is in accordance with the opinion of the first time in the Mishnah needed 26a. That's the Rambam Sefer Ha'Harei May 25:10. The Lechem Mishnah on Sefer Kabbalah 11. The house is impure. The reason is not that the afterbirth itself has a state of an offspring, but that there is no afterbirth without an offspring within it, even if it is undetected. Rabbi Shimon says the offspring disintegrated before it merged with the afterbirth. Consequently, the house is not rendered impure because the disintegrated fetus is nullified by the majority. The Gemara continues discussing the rich impurity imparted by a fetus. We learned in the Mishnah elsewhere in the Bekhorot 7:4, if a fetus dies in its mother's womb, it imparts rich impurity from when the womb opens. Yet deceased fetuses do not impart rich impurity in this manner, even during the opening of the womb, until the head of the fetus is round, like the size of a skin, a pica of yarn. So let's go back on the footnotes here. Yet deceased fetuses do not. And deceased fetus does not impart rich impurity while it's still inside its womb, as it is entirely enveloped. Once the womb opens, it imparts impurity to all items in the house, as though it has fully emerged. This is the halacha only with regard to a full-fledged fetus, whose head is the size of a skin of wool, who is at the opening of the womb. Similar deceased fetuses impart rich impurity only when the head completely exits the mother's body. The Rambam's commentary on the Mishnah explains this Gemara in an entirely different manner. Based on an earlier discussion, he writes that the indication that a womb has opened sufficiently for a fetus to impart impurity is that a mother can no longer walk on her own. The Mishnah adds that this applies only to a fetus whose head is larger than a skin of wool. A smaller fetus imparts rich impurity while its mother can walk unaided. See Tosfos Yom Tov. What was the other note here? Until the head of the fetus is round. If a fetus died in its mother's womb and its head is a sign of a skin of warp threads, and it is at the entrance of the womb, the house is rendered impure despite the fact that the fetus has not yet emerged from its mother's body. The Rambam writes that if a woman travelled between two houses while in labour and gave birth in the second house, the first residence is considered impure due to the possibility that the head of the fetus emerged there. This lacha only if the fetus's head was not the size of a skin of warp threads. If it were that size, the first house remains pure. As had the womb opened while she was there, the woman would have not been able to walk on her own. This ruling is in accordance with the two interpretations of the Mishnah Tractate Bekhorot 7:4 and the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan, Rambam Sefer Ha'Harei May 25:8. That the skin, side of a skin, a pica. What's that? A pica, a kind of spherical mass. It can refer to a round skin of thread or to a marble-like piece of metal or stone. Here it is referring to either a skin of wool or the round stone on which the wool is wrapped. Rashi explains that this is referring to the size of a skin of wool, others suggest that it means the size of the stone around which the wool was wrapped while it was spun. The Gemara asks, what is the meaning of like a skin? Rav Huna said it means like a skin of woolen yarn. Here Bar Rava said to Rav Huna, my teacher explained your statement. Were you referring to skin of warp threads or to skin of thicker warp threads? Rav Huna said to him, it is taught in the Bible in Tosefet Achalut 8:5. The seed fetuses do not impart rich impurity until the head of the fetus is the size of the skin of warp threads. This is a statement of Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Huda says the head must be the size of the skin of wolf threads. Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Sadok, says the fetus imparts impurity from the time that tefifiyot are seen near the opening of the womb. The Gemara asks, what are tefifiyot? Rabbi Huda says that Shmuel says the name of Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Sadok. This is how they were explained in Jerusalem. Tefifiyot are like folds of skin that form when the mule bends down to urinate, and the area near the womb appears as a skin emerging from within a skin. Rav Huna says, I heard two different halacha with regard to skins. Picos. During the weaving process, the threads of warp are held in place while the threads of the warp, also called weft, are passed through them. The warp threads are thinner and stronger than the warp threads, and a skin of warp threads are therefore smaller than the skin of wolf threads, containing the same length of thread. Sacks were woven with exceptionally thick thread, and skins were used by sack makers, and the skins used by sack makers were larger than skins of wolf threads. One involves a skin of warp threads, and the other involves a skin of wolf threads. I do not have the knowledge to explain to which matter these halachas refer. When Rav Dimi came to Babylon from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said, with regard to skins, I heard three different halachot. One involves the skin of warp threads, one a skin of wolf threads, and one a large skin used by sack makers. And I do not have the knowledge to explain to which matter these halachot refer. When Ravin came, he asked Ravin. Rav Dimi and Ravin were among the sages who would often travel between Eretz Yisrael and Babylonia, primarily to submit the Torah of Eretz Yisrael to the Torah centers of the diaspora, although they were occasionally arrived on business as well. Many questions, particularly ones involving the statements of the sage of Eretz Yisrael, remained unresolved in Babylonia until the messenger from Zion would arrive and elucidate a novel expression or the unique circumstances pertaining to a particular statement that required clarification. He explained this in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. To impoverish impurity, the head of a fetus in the womb of a woman must be the size of the skin of warp threads, and the head of an animal fetus must be the size of the skin of wolf threads. So what's the footnote? Animals and miscarry are not exempt from having their future offspring counted at first born unless the head of the fetus is the size of the skin of wolf threads and is at the entrance of the womb, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. And the Ramban maintained that the animal is exempt at an earlier stage, and that Rabbi Yochanan is referring to the matter of its impurity, not firstborn status. Ramban says for Kabbalah, Bekhorot 4:13, you see the rival there. As for the halacha involving skin used by sack makers, as we learned in the Bison to Tosefta Kalim Bava Metzia 7:1, for to impoverish impurity, a clod of earth that comes from an area in which uncertainty exists concerning the location of a grave or corpse, base haperas. Clods of earth that came from a base of Paris or from land outside of Eretz Yisrael impoverish impurity through physical contact as well as carrying. This applies only to clods that are at least the size of a large skin used by sack makers. The halacha is in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Yochanan and the Brisa. From Sefer Tahara Hechatumas Meis 11:3. Or from the land of Gentile nations. An example of a base of Paris is a field containing a grave that was ploughed, causing bones to be scattered throughout that field. The sages decree that one who walks to such a field or touches or carries a clod of earth that came from it is rendered impure, as though he had touched or carried the bone of a corpse. Additionally, as Gentiles would often bury their dead in any available place, the sages issued a decree that the land outside Eretz Yisrael is richly impure. The commentators explain that if the clod of earth is the size of a large skin, it might contain a bone, but not if the clod of earth is any smaller. And that's from the Rabbeinu Gershom Mo Hagola. Must be of the measure of the large skin used by sack makers, the size of which is like the seal of large sacks. Matzofin. What's that? Matzofin is large sacks. Large sacks used for storing merchandise, typically goods shipped by boat. The word is derived from the Greek masipus, a bag or pouch, and the Latin marsupium, a pouch or purse. And an item of this size is also found on the top side of the seal of a Bethlehem jug. It is known that there were several places where earthenware jugs were manufactured, Bethlehem among them. They would produce large jugs capable of holding roughly 2 seah of liquid. Estimates of the modern equivalent from 14 to 29 litres. And there's a picture of it here. If you had a chance, Gemara here on page 140, where Shlaka says the name of Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya. One who purchased fish brine from one of those who is unreliable with regard to its impurity and Amaretz. They give a footnote. One who purchases fish brine from an Amaretz may bring it into contact with water of a ritual bath in order to purify it. This is effective only if one wishes to bread into the brine, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda Nasiya and Rabbi Yirmiyah, not if one wishes to boil the brine in a pot. I'm safe the High Hachatimus Ochanan 7.5 Shochanach Yodeh 9.6 in the comment of Lamar, who must purify due to the concern that it was rendered impure while in the seller's possession, bringing it into contact with the water of a ritual bath, so that the water touches the brine and is therefore rendered pure. Was the footnote there? There's generally no way to render impure foods and liquids richly pure without them losing their status as food or drink. Nevertheless, the halacha is that one can purify impure waters by bringing it into contact with the pure water of a ritual bath. This mechanism is not a form of immersion, nor of nullification by majority. Rather, it is considered a form of planting, in which the impure water is planted, as it were, in the ritual bath and becomes part of it. See Pesachim 34b. So that the water touches the brine and is therefore rendered pure. Reish Lakish explains, the brine is pure whichever way you look at it. If the water is in the majority of the brine mixture, once he brought the brine into contact with the ritual bath, the water in the brine mixture became impure, and the impurity of the brine is nullified by the majority of pure water. And if the majority of the brine excreted by the fish itself is also pure, as brine alone is not susceptible to its impurity. So what's the footnote there? Fluids and liquids are susceptible to its impurity, as brine, the substance that seeps out of fish, while they are salted, is neither of these. It is therefore not susceptible to impurity. See the Rashi in arriving on and Duyot 8.7. Consequently, what impurity is there? Any impurity is due only to that minority of water in the mixture, and that water is nullified by the majority of brine. Rabbi Yirmiyah says the sages taught that one should use that method of purification only if he wishes to dip his bread in the brine. But for cooking in a pot with other water, this method is not effective, as the liquid of the type that was nullified, either water in the brine, found its own type, the water in the pot, and is revived. So what does that mean? Neo, revived. This might be a derivation of the word that means to awaken, lehetoro, as a nullified substance is considered to have awoken, in a manner of speaking. Alternatively, it is possibly related to the idea of shaking in na'arut, as though the prohibited mixture is being shaken or stirred into the mixture. See Rebbeinu Gershom or Hagolah arrived on the Avodah Zarah 73a. In its impure state, as the water which was previously only a minority of the mixture is now the majority. Rav Dimi was sitting and saying this halacha. Abai said to Rav Dimi, but does nullified impurity return and revive in its impure state? Rav Dimi said to him, and you, do you not hold that this is the halacha? But didn't we learn in the Mishnah in Teruma 5.2 with regard to a seah of impure teruma that fell into 100 seah of pure non-sacred produce? Rabbi Elazar says that one seah be lifted from the mixture and left to rot as impure teruma. As I say, the seah that fell is a seah that arose. So let's look at the footnotes. A seah listed first mentioned in Genesis 18:6 is a measure of dry volume used by the sages as a point of reference for many other measures of volume. Each seah contains 6 kav or 24 log. Estimates of the modern equivalent of a seah range from 7.2 to 14.4 liters. Let one seah be lifted and left to rot. Technically speaking, a seah of teruma that fell into 100 seahs of non-sacred produce is automatically nullified. Nevertheless, the sages rule that one must remove a seah from the mixture and give it to a priest, so that the latter still receives the same amount of produce. According to Rabbi Elazar, it is considered as though the seah removed from the mixture is the same seah that fell in, and therefore it is treated as impure teruma. Although priests are usually permitted to derive benefit from impure teruma, sages decree that one may not even derive benefit in this case, as people tend to treat a mixture of teruma with negligence, and consequently there is a concern that it will be eaten. See Rabbi Avadia Bartanor and Teruma 2.2. And the rabbis say, let a seah of teruma arise. So what's the footnote? If a seah of richly impure teruma falls into 100 seah of non-sacred produce, a seah is removed from the mixture and is either eaten dry, baked with fruit juice, or divided into small batches. It is assumed that the seah that fell in is not the seah that was removed. Rambam Sefer Zerayim Hilchot Teruma 14:13. Some explain that the rabbi's choice of the word ta'ala is intended to convey the same meaning Rabbi's use of the term lifted, to Rome. According to the explanation, the rabbis agree that one must remove a seah from the mixture, but they hold it is not considered as though it is the same impure seah that fell in. Since the seah is given to the priest to eat, it is treated in the manner of pure teruma, while the remaining 100 seah are considered non-sacred. Rabbeinu Gershon Moa Gordon Tosfot Yom Tosait in Tosfot. By contrast, Rashi maintains that the term ta'ala is used in its regular sense, i.e. the seah of impure teruma is nullified, and for reasons that the Gemara proceeds to explain, the entire mixture may not be allowed to come into contact with water, as if the seah was not nullified with regard to ritual impurity, and be nullified by the 100 seah of non-sacred produce, and then all 101 seah will be considered non-sacred. Nevertheless, the mixture may not be allowed to come into contact with water, so that it does not become susceptible to ritual impurity, and therefore must be eaten dry. The kudim, dry. Some commentaries interpret this word based on the verse in Joshua 9:5, in which moldy bread is called nekudim. Rashi Rabbeinu Gershon Mohagola. Others contend based on Jewish Talmud that nekudim refers to small loaves of bread, each of which is smaller than an egg ball. Rambam. It's possible this is also the meaning of the verse in Joshua, dry crumbled bread. Rambam, see 1 Kings 14:13 and Tosfot Yom Tov. Roasted. According to the opinion that the Gemara is referring specifically to the removed seah, one may not allow it to become impure because it is treated as though it is to remove Rabbeinu Gershon Mohagola. With regard to the interpretation of Rashi, who hold the Gemara is referring to entire mixture, it is puzzling that it is prohibited to render it susceptible to impurity, as the seah of impure teruma has already been nullified, and therefore all 101 seahs should be considered non-sacred produce. According to Rashi's interpretation of the Gemara in the following Omid, the Gemara itself explains the reason for this prohibition. It's unrelated to the state of teruma itself, but is designed to avoid a violation in the future different circumstance. Some write that were the entire mixture completely permitted, the owner might not give the priest anything at all, and the sages instituted this prohibition in order to avoid such an outcome. The Rosh Tosfos Yom Tov. Alternatively, it may be needed with fruit juice. Tidus b'mei favors. Fruit juice, e.g. mobile apple juice, is Rashi, does not render other substances susceptible to its impurity. Conversely, wine and oil are among the 7 liquids that render a substance susceptible to its impurity, which does not render a substance susceptible to impurity. Or alternatively, if one wishes to knead with water, it may be divided into small batches, provided that there is not an olive bulk of terum in a single batch, as an egg bulk of terum in a single batch, as an egg bulk is the minimum volume needed for food to be susceptible for contact impurity. And is taught in that regard concerning those 100 say of non-sacred produce. According to Rabbi Eliezer, what will be with them? So that moved on to the next daf. Thank you for listening. Wish you all the best and have a good week.